Belgium, 1916. The Battle of the Somme is tearing Europe apart. In a muddy trench, a British officer named Adrian Carton de Wiart is leading his men over the top when a German machine gun opens fire. The bullet strikes him directly in the face. His left eye explodes. Most men would be dead. Most men would be screaming. Most men would be evacuated immediately. Adrian Carton de Wiart ripped off his own eye patch, stuffed the wound with gauze, and kept fighting. When the battle ended 6 hours later, he had personally captured the German position. And here's the thing. This wasn't even close to the worst injury he'd suffer. In fact, this was just a Tuesday for Adrian Carton de Wiart, because over the next 30 years, he would be shot in the face again, shot in the skull, shot in the ankle, shot in the leg, shot in the hip, shot in the ear, and shot in the stomach. He survived 2 plane crashes, a torpedo strike, and being buried alive by an exploding shell. He lost his left hand in combat, and when doctors said they couldn't amputate his mangled fingers fast enough, he simply tore them off himself. He escaped from a prisoner of war camp at age 61 by jumping a fence. He won the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honour. And when he finally wrote his autobiography about all of this, he titled it Happy Days, and opened with the line, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." This is the story of the most unkillable man who ever lived. Let's go back to the beginning. Adrian Carton de Wiart was born in 1,880 inches, Brussels, Belgium. His father was a wealthy Belgian lawyer. His mother died when he was 6 years old, which perhaps explains why young Adrian grew up with absolutely no fear of anything. He was educated at Catholic school, then at Balliol College, Oxford, but university bored him. He wanted adventure, he wanted glory, he wanted war. So, in 1899, when the Second Boer War broke out in South Africa, 18-year-old Adrian did something that would define the rest of his life. He lied about his age, forged documents, and enlisted in the British Army under a false name. He didn't tell his father. He just left. Now, the Boer War was brutal. The Boers were expert marksmen fighting on their home territory. British soldiers were dying by the thousands. Adrian couldn't have been happier. Within months of arriving in South Africa, he got his first taste of combat, and it was during one of these early battles that he received his first serious injury. A Boer sniper shot him in the stomach and groin. The bullet tore through his abdomen, missing vital organs by millimeters. He was evacuated to a field hospital, where doctors told him he was lucky to be alive and that he'd need months to recover. Adrian recovered in 6 weeks. As soon as he could walk, he demanded to be sent back to the front lines. The doctors refused. They said he wasn't fit for duty. They said he needed more time. So Adrian went absent without leave and rejoined his unit anyway. This was a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 40 years. But then, something unexpected happened. His father discovered what he'd done. The forged papers, the false identity, the illegal enlistment. Adrian was pulled from South Africa and sent back to England in disgrace. Most young men would have been devastated. Most would have given up on military service entirely. Adrian Carton de Wiart was not most young men. He immediately re-enlisted, this time legally, this time under his real name, and this time with a commission as a proper British officer. And he had his eyes set on a very specific posting. The most dangerous place in the British Empire, Somaliland, East Africa, 1914. Somaliland was a nightmare posting. The Mad Mullah, a local religious leader named Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, had been waging a guerrilla war against the British for over a decade. His fighters were fierce, the terrain was unforgiving, and British casualties were mounting. Adrian volunteered immediately. Now, by this point, he'd already been promoted to captain. He'd proven himself as a capable officer. He could have had a comfortable posting in London or India. Instead, he chose Somaliland. The fighting there was vicious and personal. Close quarters combat, ambushes, raids in the scorching heat. And it was here that Adrian Carton de Wiart suffered the injury that would define his appearance for the rest of his life. During a particularly intense firefight, he was struck twice. First, a bullet grazed his ear, partially tearing it off. He ignored it. Second, a bullet shattered his left hand. Now, this wasn't a clean wound. The bullet had destroyed bones, severed tendons, and mangled his fingers beyond recognition. He was evacuated to a field hospital where the doctors examined the damage. They told him they'd need to amputate several fingers, but it would take time. They'd need to do it carefully, probably over multiple surgeries, to preserve as much function as possible. Adrian Carton de Wiart looked at his ruined hand, looked at the doctors, and said no. He couldn't wait weeks for multiple surgeries. There was fighting to do. So, he did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. He grabbed his mangled fingers and tore them off himself. The doctors were horrified. Adrian was satisfied. The hand was now definitely unsalvageable, so they performed a full amputation that same day. He was back in action within weeks, learning to shoot, fight, and command with one hand. And here's where it gets interesting. Most officers who lost a hand would be reassigned to administrative duties. A desk job, a training position, something safe. The British Army tried to do exactly that with Adrian. He refused every single desk assignment they offered him. Instead, when World War I broke out in 1914, Adrian pulled every string he could to get sent to the Western Front. He wanted to be where the fighting was heaviest. He wanted to be in France. He wanted to be at the Somme. France, 1915. The Western Front was hell on earth. Miles of trenches, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery that could erase entire battalions in seconds. The average life expectancy of a British officer in frontline combat was measured in weeks. Adrian Carton de Wiart would fight there for 3 years. He arrived in France as a lieutenant colonel, given command of the 8th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, and from day one he led from the front. Not from a headquarters miles behind the lines, not from a safe command post, from the actual front lines, in the actual trenches, with the actual soldiers. This was almost unheard of for an officer of his rank, but Adrian insisted, and his men loved him for it. Now, the first major injury on the Western Front came during the Battle of La Boiselle in 1916. Adrian was leading an assault on German positions when a shell exploded near his trench. The blast threw him into the air and slammed him into the ground with such force that he was partially buried. His men dug him out. He had a concussion, broken ribs, and temporary hearing loss. He refused evacuation and continued commanding the battle. Then came the Sommes, July 1916. The Battle of the Somme was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead. Adrian Carton de Wiart was there for all of it. And it was during one of the early Somme offensives that he suffered the injury we mentioned at the beginning, the one that took his left eye. He was leading his battalion over the top of the trench, advancing toward German machine gun positions when the bullets started flying. One struck him directly in the left side of his face. The bullet entered below his eye and exited through the back of his skull, destroying his left eye completely and fracturing his skull. He collapsed. His men thought he was dead, but then, impossibly, he stood back up. Blood was pouring down his face. His eye was gone, his skull was fractured, and Adrian Carton de Wiart pulled out a handkerchief, held it against the wound, and kept giving orders. His second-in-command rushed over and begged him to be evacuated. Adrian refused. The battle wasn't over. They hadn't taken the German position yet. So he stayed for 6 more hours. When the position was finally captured, Adrian allowed himself to be taken to a field hospital. The doctors were amazed he was still conscious. The bullet had come within centimetres of killing him instantly. They patched him up, fitted him with an eye patch, and told him he'd need months of recovery. He was back at the front in 3 weeks. Over the next year, He would be wounded 3 more times at the Somme. A bullet to the skull that fractured it again, a bullet to the ankle that shattered the bone, and a bullet to the leg that lodged itself in his thigh and was never successfully removed. He carried that bullet in his leg for the rest of his life. But it was during the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917 that Adrian earned his Victoria Cross. Passchendaele was a nightmare. The battlefield had been turned into a swamp by weeks of rain and artillery bombardment. Men drowned in shell craters filled with mud. Entire units disappeared into the muck. And in the middle of this hell, Adrian Carton de Wiart led a charge that captured a heavily fortified German position. He was wounded again during the assault. A bullet tore through his ear, taking off what was left of it after Somaliland. He ignored it and continued the attack. When the position fell, his superiors recommended him for the Victoria Cross. The citation read that he had shown most conspicuous bravery, coolness, and determination during severe operations of a prolonged nature. That was putting it mildly. By the end of World War I, Adrian Carton de Wiart had been wounded 11 times, mentioned in dispatches 8 times, and awarded the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, and numerous other decorations. He was promoted to Brigadier General. He was 40 years old, and most people thought his fighting days were finally over. They were very, very wrong. The thing about Adrian Carton de Wiart was that he didn't know what to do with peace. After World War I ended, he was assigned to various staff positions, advisory roles, diplomatic postings, the kind of work that would let him live a comfortable life and enjoy his remaining years in safety. He hated every second of it. In 1919, he was sent to Poland as part of a British military mission. Poland had just regained independence after over a century of partition, and they were immediately at war with Soviet Russia. Adrian's job was supposed to be advisory. Observer status. Stay safe, write reports, don't get involved in actual combat. Within weeks, he was on the front lines. The Polish-Soviet war was vicious. The Red Army was pushing deep into Poland, threatening Warsaw itself. The Poles were desperate, and Adrian Carton de Wiart, officially a non-combatant observer, organized and led Polish cavalry charges against Soviet positions. He was wounded twice more during this campaign, once in the leg, once in the hip. He stayed in Poland for over a year, fighting alongside the Poles until they finally pushed the Soviets back. For his service, the Polish government awarded him their highest military decorations. But more importantly, Adrian had fallen in love with Poland. He bought an estate there. He learned the language. He married a Polish woman. For the next 20 years, he would split his time between Poland and England, enjoying what he would later call the happiest years of my life. He went duck hunting. He fished. He spent time with his wife. He was, for the first time in decades, content. But he never stopped being a soldier. When Britain needed someone for dangerous assignments, they called Adrian. He undertook secret missions to Romania, Yugoslavia, and Hungary. He observed military exercises across Europe. He maintained his commission and stayed in fighting shape, because deep down, he knew what was coming. Everyone knew what was coming. War was returning to Europe, and Adrian Carton de Wiart would not miss it. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Adrian watched his adopted homeland burn. His estate was destroyed. His Polish friends were killed or scattered. His wife had died the year before. He was 59 years old. He had one eye, one hand, and more scars than he could count. And he immediately volunteered for active service. The British Army initially refused. They said he was too old. They said he'd done enough. They said he'd earned retirement. Adrian Carton de Wiart had never been so insulted in his life. He pulled every string he had. He called in every favour. He wrote letters directly to the War Office. And finally, they relented. In 1940, he was given command of the 61st Division and sent to Norway to help defend against the German invasion. World War II had begun, and Adrian Carton de Wiart was back in action. Norway, April 1940. The Norwegian campaign was a disaster from the start. The Germans had moved faster than anyone expected. British and French forces were scrambling to organize any kind of defense. Adrian arrived with his division and immediately took command of the situation. But it was hopeless. The Germans had air superiority, better equipment, and interior lines of supply. Within weeks, the Allies were evacuating, but Adrian's bad luck was about to get much, much worse. As he was being evacuated by plane, flying along the Norwegian coast towards Scotland, the aircraft's engines failed. They were going down. The pilot managed to ditch the plane in the ocean, but the impact was catastrophic. The aircraft broke apart on impact. Adrian was thrown from the wreckage into the freezing North Sea. He was 60 years old, had one hand, one eye, and was weighed down by his uniform and equipment. Most men would have drowned immediately. Adrian Carton de Wiart tread water for over an hour until a rescue boat found him. When they pulled him aboard, he was hypothermic and half drowned. The medics examined him and found that he'd also broken several ribs in the crash. He was evacuated to England, treated for his injuries, and told to rest. He rested for 2 weeks. Then he demanded another assignment. The War Office, by this point thoroughly aware that Adrian Carton de Wiart would never stop, decided to send him somewhere they thought he couldn't possibly get into too much trouble. They sent him to Yugoslavia as head of the British military mission. His job was to coordinate with Yugoslav partisans resisting the German occupation. It was supposed to be a diplomatic posting. Meetings, planning, coordination. No actual combat. 6 months later, in 1941, Adrian was in Cairo preparing to fly back to Yugoslavia when he boarded another plane. That plane also crashed. This time, it was a mechanical failure over the Libyan desert. The aircraft lost power and went down hard, crashing in the sand and breaking apart. Adrian survived with cuts, bruises, and another concussion. The other passengers thought they were going to die in the desert. Adrian reassured them that they'd be fine and that rescue would come. He was right. They were rescued the next day. But here's where things get interesting. The plane had crashed in Italian-controlled territory, and when the rescue team arrived, they weren't British. They were Italian soldiers, and they arrested everyone on board. Just like that, Adrian Carton de Wiart became a prisoner of war. Adrian was taken to a prisoner of war camp in northern Italy, near the town of Sulmona. The Italians knew exactly who they'd captured. A British general, holder of the Victoria Cross, wounded in combat more times than most soldiers even saw combat. They were taking no chances. He was placed in a special high-security section of the camp. Extra guards, daily inspections, constant surveillance. Adrian immediately began planning his escape. Now remember, he was 61 years old at this time. He had one hand, one eye, and multiple old injuries that should have left him barely mobile. But Adrian Carton de Wiart had been shot in the face, buried alive, and survived 2 plane crashes. A prison camp was nothing. He spent months studying the guards' routines, the layout of the camp, and the surrounding terrain. He made contact with other prisoners who were planning escapes. He gathered supplies, forged documents, and waited for the right moment. And then, one night in 1943, he made his move. He and several other prisoners cut through the barbed wire fence using tools they'd been smuggling for months. They waited until the guards changed shifts, crawled through the opening, and ran. Adrian Carton de Wiart, 63 years old, was escaping from a prisoner of war camp. The escape itself was successful. They made it out of the camp and into the Italian countryside. But now came the hard part. They needed to reach Allied lines, which meant crossing hundreds of miles of German-occupied Italy. For 8 days, they moved at night and hid during the day. They stole food from farms. They avoided German patrols. They navigated by the stars. And then, on the 8th day, they were betrayed. An Italian farmer spotted them and reported their location to the local police. Within hours, German soldiers surrounded their hiding place. Adrian and his companions were recaptured. But here's the thing. Most escaped prisoners who were recaptured faced severe punishment. Solitary confinement, beatings, sometimes execution. Adrian Carton de Wiart was treated like a celebrity. The German and Italian officers who interrogated him were in awe. They'd heard the stories. They'd read his service record. They knew about the Victoria Cross, the wounds, the escapes. One German officer allegedly told him, "General, you are the bravest man I have ever met. It is an honor to have captured you." Adrian was returned to the camp, but now with even tighter security. The Italians were not going to let him escape again. But Adrian wasn't done yet. Over the next several months, he attempted 4 more escape attempts, 4 more times. At age 63, all 4 attempts failed, but the Italians were getting frustrated. They couldn't execute a British general. They couldn't torture him without causing a diplomatic incident. But they absolutely could not let him escape. So they did the only thing they could think of. They moved him to a castle, Castello di Vincigliata, an ancient fortress near Florence. High walls, limited access, and guards everywhere. It was supposed to be escape-proof. Adrian immediately began planning his next escape. But before he could attempt it, something happened that changed everything. September 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies. The camp guards simply opened the gates and left. Adrian Carton de Wiart walked out of the castle, made his way to Allied lines, and immediately reported for duty. He had been a prisoner for over 2 years. He was now 63 years old, and Winston Churchill had a job for him. Churchill's mission for Adrian was unusual, even by his standards. He was to be Britain's personal representative to Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of nationalist China. His job was to coordinate Allied operations in China, manage relations between the British, Americans, and Chinese, and help plan the war against Japan. It was a diplomatic posting, a prestigious one, the kind of assignment that would normally go to a career diplomat or a senior statesman. Churchill sent a one-eyed, one-handed, 63-year-old general who had escaped from a POW camp 4 months earlier. Adrian flew to China in 1943 and spent the next 2 years there. And for the first time in his life, he was frustrated. Not because of danger, not because of combat, because there wasn't enough combat. His role was diplomatic. He attended meetings, wrote reports, coordinated logistics. It was important work, vital work even, but it wasn't fighting. He later wrote in his autobiography that these were some of the most boring years of his life. This was a man who had been shot 11 times, survived 2 plane crashes, and escaped from a POW camp, calling diplomatic work boring. But he did his job well. He helped coordinate the Burma campaign, managed the complex relationship between British and American forces in Asia, and earned the respect of Chiang Kai-shek himself. In 1945, the war ended. Adrian Carton de Wiart was 65 years old. He had fought in 3 wars, spanning 5 decades. He had been wounded more times than he could accurately count. He had earned Britain's highest military honours and the respect of soldiers from a dozen nations. Finally, he retired. He moved to Ireland and bought a small estate. He spent his time fishing and writing his memoirs. He lived quietly for the first time in his adult life. And in 1963, at the age of 83, Adrian Carton de Wiart died peacefully in his sleep. No bullets, no explosions, no plane crashes, just old age. When his autobiography, Happy Days, was published, readers were stunned by its tone. Adrian had lived one of the most violent, dangerous lives imaginable, and he had loved every minute of it. He wrote about losing his eye as an inconvenience. He described being shot as rather interesting. He called World War I the most enjoyable time of my life. Near the end of the book, he wrote, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war. It had given me many things I had wanted in life. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what made Adrian Carton de Wiart truly unkillable. It wasn't just his physical resilience, though that was extraordinary. It wasn't just his courage, though he had that in abundance. It was that he never saw himself as a victim. He never complained about his wounds. He never regretted his choices. He had lived exactly the life he wanted to live, a life of adventure, danger, and purpose. And nothing, not bullets, not bombs, not plane crashes, not prisoner of war camps, nothing could take that away from him. Adrian Carton de Wiart was shot in the face, head, stomach, ankle, leg, hip, and ear. He survived 2 plane crashes, a torpedo strike, and being buried alive. He tore off his own fingers and escaped from a POW camp at age 61. And through it all, he never stopped smiling. Because for Adrian Carton de Wiart, every single day was a good day to be alive, even the ones where he got shot